The difference in demand between the OECD world and the non-OECD world is now becoming quite marked. Now, in the OECD world, which is the one we know and understand and we have lots of data about, demand is relatively weak and may actually be starting to shrink. Whereas in the non-OECD world, where unfortunately our data is much weaker, this is where the really dynamic growth, the sort of growth we saw in Europe in the 60s, is occurring, you know, the 5–7% a year. Now, the position we've reached is that for the first time ever, if you take all the energies together, oil, gas and coal, the OECD world and the non-OECD world are now equally large. If you go to just oil, then the non-OECD world is still slightly smaller. It's about 45% of the total, and the OECD is a little bit bigger at 55%. But that gap is obviously closing pretty rapidly, and in no time it will probably be the other way around. In the OECD world, there is now, and I'm sure people have mentioned it, that this possibility of peak demand. BP has been advancing this idea that we might be running into peaks in demand. If you look at Europe, for example, although we briefly re-attained the levels last seen in 1979, in the late 90s, early 2000s, it has quite clearly been weakening since and is probably on a gently declining trajectory. Certainly this year, there's quite sharp falls in all the European countries, though we don't anticipate that will sort of go on. It should stabilise a little bit. If we look at the United States, it appears to have peaked around 2005 and again be on a gently declining trajectory. 2005 is a bit recent, so we can't be completely sure. For the whole OECD, it appears to have peaked in 2005 also. Again, a little bit soon, we can't be quite sure. What we can be reasonably sure is we're not going to see a lot of demand growth out of the OECD. Therefore, we need to look at the other part of the world. Now, in effect, this is the supply challenge, because with demand potentially growing at between 5 and 7% a year in the non-OECD world, and with 2, maybe 3 billion people approaching the point where they are rich enough to become significant oil consumers in terms of owning cars and you know, taking flights and the rest of it. So in that sense, that demand will just inexorably go up. So even if there's no demand growth in the OECD area, you know, in effect, world demand fairly rapidly would be going up at half the non-OECD level. So you get 3.5% annual growth, something like that. So it is going to catch up. So we have this very strange position at the moment where the immediate outlook is quite weak, where there's plenty of excess capacity. People will be worrying about price rather than supply, and price will be tending to stay weak. Then we will finally get to the point where that slop in the system, if you like, has been eroded. Now, of course, we will have then had several years of weak demand, probably difficult investment in the high-cost company-accessible resources like tar sands, like very deep water. It will be very difficult to have justified the alternative investments in biofuels or other alternatives. So we're going to hit the wall at some point when we'll have very few alternatives to turn to. We won't have made the investments, but we will have run out of, you know, this, what will have been this relatively cheap energy supply. So it's actually an even more difficult picture than we thought, because we thought the price was going to grind upwards and that this would facilitate the investments in the alternatives, and that would take the pressure off the oil supply. Now we have this, you know, feast followed by famine with a rather dramatic turn turnaround between the two.